is over.
Jitolata, the Russian Nightmare here, and you are listening to the Insiders Wrestling Podcast. Stay tuned.
Hello, everyone, and this is the Insiders Wrestling Podcast, and we have a special treat for you today, and I don't want to waste a lot of time with a long introduction because I'm really excited to get started and interview this legend that we have with us today, the Russian Nightmare himself, the one and only Nikita Koloff. How are you doing today, sir?
Hey, Jeff and Joe, it's just an honor and a privilege to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
We're really excited
excited.
and honored to speak with you today. So I guess we'll get right into it. How did you initially get into the sport of professional wrestling?
Well, it's an interesting story. Of course, we have a brief time together today on the podcast, and of course, if people want to read the full story, there's a couple ways they can do that. One, they can do that for free at nikitakoloff.com, or they can go on Amazon and find my latest book, Nikita, A Tale of the Ring and Redemption, which tells my whole entire life story, my biography, if you will. But the Cliff Note version for today is wrestling was not on my radar growing up as a kid in Minneapolis, Moscow, Minnesota. And it wasn't on my radar. I mean, I fell in love with weightlifting at the age of 12 and began to watch the NFL on television, had a dream to play one day in the NFL, and began to pursue that through junior high school, and into my college days. And it was during the latter part of my college career that some of my friends had gotten into wrestling, some notable names that your listeners might recognize: Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, Ravishing Rick Rude, Barry Darsow, Hawk and Animal, the Legion of Doom Road Warriors. And some of those guys had got into wrestling while I was still pursuing a college and professional football career. And then one day, randomly, out of the blue, I got a call from Road Warrior Animal, who shared with me a storyline for a partner for the Russian Bear, Ivan Koloff, in the Carolinas. And that was the beginning of the journey through a 5-minute phone call, sight unseen, with a promoter named Jim Crockett. And that was my introduction into professional wrestling.
That's awesome.
Wow, man.
So I want to backtrack a little bit because you talked about playing football in junior high and high school and college. Tell us a little bit about who was on the team with you there at Robbinsdale High School.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I'm convinced one day somebody will make a movie about this, but it's an interesting story because, the closest thing that comes to what I'm about to tell you would be all the guys that came out of West Texas State University. I mean, Tully Blanchard, Tito Santana, Ted DiBiase, and I think even the Funks. I mean, one Terry maybe, but there was a lot of guys that came out of West Texas State University, ended up in pro wrestling, but they all came from different towns, right? And
Right.
They went to the same college. Well, from Robbinsdale High School, during my period of high school, there were 7 of us, and here's the names. Starting with Barry Darsow, who graduated a year after me. And then in my graduating class, John Nord, who was known as Nord the Barbarian and Nord the Berserker. John Nord. And in addition to me and John Nord, there was a guy named Tom Zink, who wrestled as the Z-Man, Ravishing Rick Rude. There was Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig. One of the lesser known was Brady Boone, wrestled as Brady Boone here in the Carolinas and refereed. And who am I forgetting? Because there was, and there was 5 of us. There were 7 of us. I think I only gave you 6, but 5 of the 7 were actually on the same high school football team one year. It's kind of crazy.
Wow, that's unbelievable. Wow.
Yeah, and if you one step further, a few years prior, but also graduates of Robbinsdale High School, were 2 guys by the name of Vern Gagne and Mean Gene Okerlund.
Oh man.
So it must have been in the water in Robbinsdale there.
Wow, no kidding. Jeez. Man, you guys must have had some football team. Oh man.
Yeah. You know what, Joe? Everybody says that, but here's the problem. You could have great athletes, but anyone and everyone knows, a team that isn't just made up of great athletes. You have to have really good coaching. And unfortunately, we were a mediocre 500 ball club because we just didn't have good coaching. We had great athletes. We did not have good coaching. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Oh man, no kidding. That makes a lot of sense. You've got to have that good leader in place. You're absolutely right.
Wow. So we'll go back to your introduction into wrestling, and you talked about how you had this storyline pitched to you sight unseen. If you could briefly just tell our audience how it was that you started training for professional wrestling, because I found this story interesting as well. Yeah,
the interesting part of the story is there was no training in the professional wrestling. I mean, literally no training. When Animal called me that morning, he told me the story, and I asked him this question. I go, do they know I have no amateur wrestling background, none, like 0, and 0 professional training? A lot of rumors fly around that I went to Eddie Sharkey's school. I did not. A lot of the other guys did. I did not. I was training for pro football. And so when I called Jim Crockett that morning, Joe gave me the number. I called Jim Crockett and I said, now, Mr. Crockett, you understand, before I come to a city where I've never been, you understand I've got no amateur background, no professional training. You understand? He says, yes, I do. And I said, and you're okay? Okay, and you're good with that? Yep. I said, well, what's the next step? And he literally just said this. He goes, be in my office on such and such a day with your head shaved, bald. I go, that's it? Basically, yeah, that's it. I go, okay, see you then. So literally a 5-minute phone call, sight unseen. No cell phones in those days, so you're not snapping a selfie and sending it over. So 2 months later, I drove into it. I loaded everything up in my car that I had to my name, which wasn't much. All the money I had to my name, which wasn't much. Drove to a city that I'd never been to before. Walked into the office the day he said to be there. Introduced myself. And Nikita Koloff was born in the hallways of Charlotte, North Carolina that day.
Man, wow. Wow, that's unbelievable. That's a fantastic story. I mean, I would imagine I would imagine they probably figured you were pretty well trained. I mean, if you were heading, trying to go for a career in professional football, that I'm sure, obviously back in the day and everything like that, there was a lot of training going on there. So I'm sure that's probably why they figured, hey, this guy's going to fit right in.
Well, the interesting thing, again, no pictures. No, I mean, he didn't say, send me a photo of you or nothing. He just said, be in my office on this. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. And the interesting part of the story is, to give you a little more backstory, the interesting part of the story is if I go back to age 12, when I fell in love with weightlifting, picked up a magazine called Iron Man.
Oh yeah.
It was a bodybuilding magazine. And really, I was infatuated by the guys. I'm like, man. And I remember saying these words. It's important part of the story. At age 12, I said these words. I said, one day, I'm going to look like one of the guys in this magazine.
Wow. Fast
forward 12 years, I walk into Jim Crockett's office in Charlotte, North Carolina. And from maybe 100-pound fledgling kid at age 12, when I walked into Jim Crockett's office, sight unseen, to, you know, in a sense took a chance, but then I took a chance too, right? I took a risk and drove to a city I'd never been.
Absolutely.
When I walked in, what he saw was a guy, it was kind of weird. He asked me to take my shirt off. I'm like, okay, that's kind of weird, but okay. But he saw a guy that was 285 pounds, 8% body fat with a 34-inch waist. And so what I said I'd become 12 years prior is what he saw the day I walked into his office.
Wow. Wow, man, that's awesome. Well, there you go. That's it. Almost like it was definitely fate and everything like that there too. That's really awesome. Very cool.
Right. Yeah. Right place at the right time. I fully believe that. No question in my mind. Right place at the right time. And again, I mean, I still had to prove myself, but so the story is very unique in that way. But nevertheless, a door of opportunity was opened, and I walked through it.
That's awesome. And was it kind of the same way with how you were introduced to Ivan Koloff?
Yeah, well, so I'm in his office that day. He says, wait here. He walks out, walks back in with two guys who I didn't have a clue who they were. And he says, Ivan Koloff, Don Cornotto, meet your new tag team partner. And that was my first introduction to those guys. And they were doing interviews there at the office that day. They stuck me on the interview, said, look, you don't speak any English. Part of the story, right? You're just off the boat. I want your shirt off. Ivan, put your chains around his neck. Every time they do an interview, stand there, look mean. I go, okay, I don't have to talk. I stand here, look mean. That should be easy enough. Pretty natural. And I get paid to do this, which I guess, I mean, we didn't even talk money. It just said, okay. And we did hours of interviews. And then at the conclusion, Crockett said, be in Raleigh, North Carolina tomorrow night. You're going to wrestle on television.
Oh, man.
And I'm like, okay.
Oh, wow.
A day after you got introduced to everyone and just showed up in Charlotte sight unseen.
Sight unseen, showed up in Charlotte. We get to the arena in Raleigh that night. We got there late. It was not my fault, by the way, but we got there late. So wasn't even any time really to get in the ring, to do any practice or of any sort. They showed me in the dressing room how to tie up and lock up and do a couple things. And the who's who of wrestling, I remember, was there that night. Now, again, I learned all this after the fact because I didn't know a lot of these guys at the time, but I remember guys like the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, the Tower of Power, too sweet to be sour, if you will. Yeah. Dusty was there. King Kong Bundy, Stan Hansen, the Lariat Stan. I mean, you know, who's who of wrestling was there that night. And you know, I didn't have a clue, but there I was debuting in a sold-out arena on television.
Man, wow. What a debut. Holy cow.
Yeah, pretty crazy.
Got thrown right into the fire.
Right into it.
What do they call it? Trial by fire, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. I trained for about 8 months before my first real match.
Okay.
Before I actually wrestled more than 3 minutes in squash matches, beating up guys. So
yeah. So you know.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So who are some of your favorites to work with in the ring?
That's a great question. I mean, I look back on it. I mean, I would say the majority of guys that I had the opportunity to work with, I feel fortunate. I mean, man, I had early in that first year, I had the privilege of working, especially in guys who were more known in the Mid-Atlantic back in those days because, you know, television wasn't as broad and it was really maybe just from magazines that some guys, you know, fans knew about certain guys. But I had the privilege, thinking back on it, even that first year, wrestling guys like Rufus R. Freight Train Jones, Johnny Weaver, who was legendary in the NWA, Dory Funk Jr., Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Jay Youngblood, Mark Youngblood, Wahoo McDaniel. I mean, those are just a handful of the names in the early days, and then went on to work with, of course, Steve Austin and Lex Luger, Sting, of course, the Road Warriors, Dusty Rhodes, of course, the Nature Boy Ric Flair, Rock and Roll Express, and Manny Fernandez, Rick Rude, and so many others. And I would summarize to say, for the most part, I really enjoyed working with the majority of guys. Now, there were a few guys that I was a bit apprehensive about, Van Vader being one. In fact, my very last match, I got injured, a double injury in that match. It was not career ending, but I got injured nevertheless. He had kind of a reputation of being a bit reckless. And so I was more cautious to get in the ring with him. Jake the Snake Roberts was another one that I was more cautious to get in the ring with. But I don't know if I could really count those guys on one hand. I'd say the majority guys I got in the ring with, I really enjoyed working with.
Wow. Unbelievable. That's a who's who. So I just have to sneak a quick question in. I mean, I've been going to wrestling. I've been going to wrestling events since I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. And I remember my dad taking me to some local stuff up here. We live in Northeast Pennsylvania. So I got to ask you, because I'm 50 years old now, so my memory is not what it used to be. But did you ever wrestle in the Philadelphia Spectrum? Because I do remember going to some events there when I was younger, and I remember Ivan Koloff being at some of those. So did you ever wrestle in this area during that time?
Well, that I recall, my matches in Philly were at the Civic Center downtown.
Okay, in the Civic Center. Okay.
The old Civic Center, which it's kind of cool. A good friend of mine who actually we co-wrote a book together called Wrestling with Success. His name is Jeffrey Gittimer. He tells me this over and over and over again, the stories of bringing his daughters to the Philadelphia Civic Center, sitting in the balcony in the front row seats and leaning over, and his daughters just loving it, and the Road Warrior music coming on, and Boogie Woogie Man, Jimmy Valiant's music, and all that. And Philadelphia was an interesting city because when we first went there, when we first started expanding and going into the WWF territory, most of the time we were there, Vince was running over at the Spectrum. And we were running, heads up night, same night, right? Head-to-head competition. And we'd have 10,000 people at the Spectrum. He'd had 10,000 over at the Civic Center and at the Spectrum, respectively. Anyway, that said, to condense the answer, what was interesting memory about Philly is when we first went there, it was a challenge because, and I say that because the fan was used to a 15-minute entrance, a 5-minute match, and a 15-minute exit. I won't name any names, but not a whole lot of wrestling, right? I remember some of the first matches. We wrestled, Ric Flair and I wrestled for an hour there. I think one of my first matches there. And I want to tell you, no kidding, people chanted boring for 55 minutes.
Oh, boy.
And because they just weren't used to our brand, right? Of what we were doing. Now, I will say for the record, Philadelphia became some of the funnest fans to wrestle in front of. It took about 6 months of conditioning the fan to our brand. But I want to tell you, 6 months later, people are standing on their feet for 55 minutes when I'm wrestling Flair, not chanting boring. And so it was fun to kind of groom the Philadelphia fan into our style of wrestling. It was fun.
Wow, that's awesome. I think I may have been to, you know what, now that you mention it, I think we may have been to a few at the Civic Center as well, because I know I was there for, again, I was probably, like I said, 7, 8, 9 years old in and around there when my dad took me. So it was a while ago. But yeah, I know we have been in the Civic Center for wrestling. So yeah, I'm sure I could have been at one of those matches. So yeah, and for a young kid, listen, if I got to see any kind of wrestling back then, it was exciting no matter where I went.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I appreciate you being such a long-time loyal fan, too. That's awesome.
So we heard you do a very great impression of Dusty Rhodes. I'd love to hear just one of your favorite stories of working with Dusty and being around him. I know you guys had the superpowers, but I definitely want to get a story about Dusty if you don't mind.
Well, I would just say it was certainly, again, when he first came into the territory to book the territory, I took a liking to Dusty, and I think we had early on a real mutual respect for one another, and I like to think he saw my potential, and being willing to put the U.S. heavyweight belt on me, to put the world TV title belt on me, to put me in main event matches, against the Nature Boy, the world tag belts, the world six man. And certainly it was fun. Initially, the chemistry between the two, obviously our appearances were slightly different, which slightly, which made him, in a sense, kind of the underdog, but he had so much charisma, and the fans just absolutely loved him, that it just made it bode well for the Russian Nightmare, the Russian Nightmare Nikita Koloff, to wrestle the American Dream. And then later on, the brilliant idea of my turning, coming to his aid after the accident with Magnum TA, and then the legendary matches of the Superpowers and or the Road Warriors against any combination of the Four Horsemen, certainly lends to some wonderful memories, and just being able to travel around the country and many times drive up and down the roads. He and I would jump into his red convertible Mercedes and drive to local towns here in the Carolinas and Virginia, and just to have that quality time with him. I just really, personally fell in love with the man. And although we didn't communicate that as much towards the latter part of his career, with me heading off full-time into ministry and him continuing on the path of wrestling, but whenever we did see each other at a WrestleMania or somewhere else, it was just like we, just picked up where we left off, and, with a hug and embrace and just laughter and friendship,
Wow, man.
That's great. And I know that Ivan Koloff was very instrumental early on, because like you said, you didn't have formal training, so to speak. So if you could tell us a little bit about how he helped you with training and learning the ropes, so to speak, in professional wrestling.
Yeah, no pun intended, right?
Right, that's right.
I mean, hats off, kudos to Uncle Ivan, who people ask, is he really your uncle? I'm like, well, on TV land, but he was he's as much or more of an uncle to me as any uncle I had. So, but kudos to Ivan and Don Kernodle both. They were the world tag team champions. Don Kernodle and Sergeant Slaughter were the ones who originated the idea of a nephew for Ivan, and introduced that idea to Jim Crockett. And he was open to it. He goes, yeah, well, if you can find the guy. And by the way, when Don Kernodle approached Road Warrior Animal, he asked him this question: Joe, do you know any big guys who wouldn't mind shaving their head and becoming a Russian? That was the question. And Animal goes, yeah, I know the guy right now. So he made the phone call, right? And but so much credit to Don and Ivan, because what we did from that debut in Raleigh, North Carolina, was we would drive to the towns. And listen, back then, and I don't know how the business operates now, but put it in perspective, in 1986, I had 454 matches.
Wow.
So you do the math on that. We worked a lot, right?
Jeez, that's more than a match a day. That's crazy.
That is correct. But that said, the first 2 or 3 months of my career, Ivan, Don, and I would get to towns 2-3 hours early. They would bump all over the ring, teaching me the mechanics of wrestling. I'd have a very short singles match or handicap, squash 2 guys at one time. Ivan would sit in my corner. They'd have a world tag match. I'd sit in their corner. And then on the way home, we talk about the old school psychology of wrestling. So mechanics before the matches, psychology after the matches, And that's how I learned from Don and Ivan, and then eventually guys like Dusty and Rick Steamboat and Ric Flair and others.
Wow, man, that's incredible. So you really, I mean, it's really learning on the fly. You were just really learning every day as you went.
On the job training every single day. Every day was different. Every day was new, learning something new every day. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So I got to just ask you real quick, because obviously you played, I mean, this was as heel could get back then, because obviously the Cold War going on and everything like that. And I always wondered, I mean, you know, being that character, man, you guys must have really generated some heat. That had to be, you know, going into those stadiums. I mean, at that point in time, the heat there must have been incredible. What did you feel about that?
Well, you know, great question, and very true. It was of course, Ivan and I, you know, just fully played off that. I mean, my mentality was, okay, if I'm really from there, what am I going to act like, look like, you know, portray, and in my persona with my looks and intensity and everything else. Of course, Ivan in some of his interviews, like for example, we go to Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of Fort Bragg, and Ivan would cut an interview and go, and I want to see all of you soldier boys in your yellow dresses in the front row. And I'm like, Ivan, are you kidding me? I'm like, well, I'll tell you, those soldier boys were in the front row, but they weren't wearing yellow dresses, and they were letting us know rather quickly we were number one in their hearts. And, if you know what I mean. And, but yeah, so it was not hard to get the USA chant going in pretty much any arena we went in. And one other little side note, I literally had 6 matches, 5 against the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, 1 against Magnum TA up near his hometown, where fans literally bolted over the barrier and it either came in the ring or attempted to come. In fact, if you watch the very first ever Great American Bash, you go back and watch that, you'll see a fan pin me up against the ropes. That was not part of the story, folks, just for the record. That was a fan coming after me. 6 times they came out. And there were death threats. Now, you're down there in Cheraw, South Carolina. One time I remember Crockett said, he came to us, he goes, hey, you know, we were headed off to Charleston, right? Down on King Street down there in Charleston, South Carolina. And Crockett goes, hey, I'll give you a heads up. We got a few phone calls, a few death threats, but no worries. You know, we'll just beef up security. And I'm like,
oh, jeez.
But in those days, right, when you're younger, you kind of feel like you're 10 foot tall and bulletproof anyway, right? So
you do, right?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I didn't really. I for the most part, honestly, didn't think a whole lot about it, but I was conscious of protecting myself, you know.
Wow, man, that's incredible. Again, that's something I always wondered, because, you know, after growing up and seeing that when I was younger and thinking to myself, oh my goodness, you know, and you're just enthralled in the storyline. And then as you get older and you start to learn more about the business and things, you know, then you realize, man, these poor guys must have really gotten a lot of hate, you know, directed their way. But then, hey, that's what you were supposed to do. So, I mean, you did an amazing job at it.
Yeah, that was in that era. It was different in that era, right? I mean, now, you know, with the advent of being known as sports entertainment, I mean, listen, in the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, you know, people had their suspicions as to how real wrestling was. Nevertheless, boy, it still drew people in to really believe. I remember, little side story here. I remember my first professional match I ever went to was back in my college days. I was training at a gym called Ventura's Gym, a little sweat box in North Minneapolis. The guy's name, Jesse the Body Ventura.
Oh, man.
And he had there was a big match, a big show in the St. Paul Civic Center. And he gave 25 of us muscleheads tickets to the show. And he was doing a deadlift match against a guy named Paul Ellering.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
oh
Versus
man.
Paul Ellering. They were doing a deadlifting competition as part of the wrestling show that night. Long story short, 18,000 people, Paul Ellering fans, 25 Jesse Ventura fans. Yeah, okay? And I'm going to tell you, when we were leaving that night, and we were the only ones cheering Jesse, he throws chalk in Ellering's eyes, and he gets hurt in the whole deal. You can picture what happened there. But a great angle, great story they were telling. Anyway, we're leaving, and I want to say this woman had to be 80 years old, at least. And we're waiting to get on this elevator, and a whole group of us, and I happen to make eye contact with her, and I'm telling you a true story. I look at her, we make eye contact, and she stops. And she looks, and she said just like this, too. She goes, you're those Jesse Ventura fans. She goes, if I had a knife, I'd stick it in his gut. I'd stick it in every one of yours as well. I was like, wow. Some of these people taking this pretty serious here, right? So,
Oh my goodness.
different era of wrestling.
Yes.
For the
man.
modern day fan, you probably can't even relate to all that.
Oh man. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I totally hear what you're saying, because I mean, even, I was probably in the 80s, I was, in my teens, 13, 14 years old. And I remember in high school, we had to write a paper, and they, I wrote a paper on pro wrestling. And that was one of the things we discussed was, everybody's saying, people would come up to me and saying, it's not real. And back then I'm like, yeah, yes, it is. And then I ended up writing a paper trying to explain why everything was real in pro wrestling. So I totally get where you're coming from.
Hey, the irony to all this? Wrestling's the most real thing out there, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is very true, sir. That is very true.
And those were definitely the days where all of the wrestlers lived their gimmicks, even outside of the ring, outside of being in an interview studio or anything else. And, you guys stayed in character, so to speak, even outside of the walls of wrestling.
Yeah, many yes. I mean, many of the guys did, and there's an expression back in those days. Of course, not every guy adhered to it, or there's just certain situations where you just couldn't. But the expression was kayfabe, meaning
right.
I mean, the old school mentality was protect this business. It's a very close-knit group of men and women, promoters. Let's protect it, and do our best to do that. And so for the most part, the majority of us tried to do that.
Man, that's awesome.
So I have another question for you that's kind of fast forward, but talk to us a little bit about when you retired and what you've been doing after wrestling.
Well, I look back at my career, and again, very grateful and thankful for the opportunity that Jim Crockett provided me, and I had set a goal when I was young, a youngster. One of my little pet peeves as a kid was why can't athletes? Why do they have to hang around so long that you might say they're basically past their prime, right? If you want to say it that way. And I said, man, when I make it, of course, I was thinking football. I'm like, I'm going to walk away on top, and so when I broke into wrestling, I told Ivan and Don from day one. We argued about it for a couple of weeks. I just gave up on it. And I said, hey, I'll be out of active wrestling, like active in the ring, by the time I'm 35. And they're like, oh, Don's like, no way, it'll get in your blood, and you'll do it forever. But anyway, and I used to even have discussions with other guys. I'm like, hey guys, there's life after wrestling. They're like, no, this is all I know. And I'm like, man, don't sell yourself so short. You got all kinds of gifts and talents, and so I used to argue with a lot of the guys about that, trying to encourage them that, hey, you can do something besides wrestle, right? Rick Steiner, for example, has got a thriving real estate business down in Georgia, and other guys, outside of wrestling. Magnum has had a great career out in the marketplace, and even post-injury, post-accident. And, and I had opened up gyms and health clubs and been invested in other nutrition businesses and other things over the years. And little did I know, though, that upon my departure from wrestling at the tail end of 1992, leading into 1993, where life would take a very decisive turn for me. Not on the radar. Once again, kind of like wrestling, this was not on the radar. But I'd met a Christian couple through a business venture that I was involved in 1993. They invited me to church. So I didn't grow up in church, just like I didn't, to break somebody's heart, I didn't grow up in Russia. I grew up in Minnesota, but I didn't grow up in church. But I knew the story, right? And here we are, just centered around the celebration, Easter weekend celebration, the resurrection of Jesus, having celebrated the Passover and Good Friday, but I didn't grow up in all that. But I understood the story intellectually, if you will. But through that invitation to attend these folks' church, 17 October 1993. Something happened that forever changed my life. I showed up, they met me there. I showed up at their church, and an invitation was given. I went down to the altar and got on my knees and surrendered my life to Jesus, and life's never been the same since. And little did I know from that decision that day that fast forward all these years later, now I will have I've been to all 50 states. I've traveled so far to 30 different countries, many of them ministry related, not all of those trips, but many of them. Many of the churches I go minister at are guys like yourself who grew up watching wrestling and now are pastoring a church and find out I'm an evangelist and go, man, would you consider coming in and sharing your story and preaching the gospel? And so that's what I've been doing. And one other little side note, God had really placed on my heart men's ministry. And so in addition to traveling the world doing revivals, crusades, and preaching, I do a lot of men's ministry. I mean, breakfast, lunch, dinners. And in fact, Lex Luger and I launched a men's ministry in Kannapolis, North Carolina last year called Man Camp. And if any guy 18 years or older, can be from any kind of background, want to learn more about that, just go to mancamp.info and you'll find out more about that. But we bring small groups of men together, and him and I pour into those men over a handful of days on how to be physically healthy, mentally healthy, emotionally healthy, of course, spiritually healthy, just be a whole well-rounded guy, and equipping them to go back to their homes and their communities and just impact their community, their families, their marriages, their children, likewise. So, yeah, that's in a nutshell. That's where life turned for me in 1993.
Wow, that's so great to hear. You know what, I say this often. We live in I mean, goodness knows, especially with everything going on outside now. I mean, everything's scary, but we live in a world where there's just not. And you see so many bad things. And I think a lot of it's due to social media. I really think that, because they glorify the bad. And I it's so great to hear something like that where, people, you're reaching out to people, you're, like you were saying, you were talking to these men and helping them to, just cope with some of the things in life and get back to being spiritual. I grew up Catholic. My mother was, very, very Catholic. We went to services, sometimes every day during Easter and stuff like that. So,
Sure.
I've been in that. And I mean, it's great to have some, that's why I said, I was talking to my wife about this the other day. I said, it's great to just have faith, and I think that's really not out there as much anymore. And I think people would just be less scared about things if they just had a little bit of faith in stuff. So,
well, yeah, Joe, I agree. It's faith over fear, right? You can't you can't live with, they don't live side by side. It's either you have faith, you walk in faith, or you walk in fear. In fact, the love of Jesus says perfect love casts out all fear. And faith is for the present moment and lives in our heart. Hope is for the future and lives in our head. Just think about it that way. And my hope is, even in the midst of this crisis or any other crisis, presently it's a virus. Well, in the future, it might be a financial crisis or a family crisis or a health crisis, something, you're battling with some kind of a health issue. But to your point, man, I don't know what I'd do without my faith and my love for the Lord and my relationship with Jesus. That's what carries me through each and every day. And for those who may not have that or don't have that, I pray that this current crisis opens your eyes to that possibility of how to navigate the storms of life. And it's through my faith and my relationship in Jesus. And for the listeners out there, I encourage you, if you don't have that, to pursue that path and just see what is revealed to you in your pursuit of that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I just think it's, it's something for people to be happy about. And again, like I said, you just don't see it enough. And, you see embellished violence and just all this kind of stuff all the time. But, oh man, I agree with you. That's fantastic, man. That's really great to hear. And you partnered up with Lex Luger, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, we're tag teaming again, the total package and the Russian Nightmare, and we just say we have a lot of fun at these camps. We do a lot of fun things there, as a part of the camp itself, and a lot of great fellowship, and so like I said, I really encourage guys to check into that and check out the website and stuff. But you're just spot on. I mean, in terms of, in terms of the strength of the family unit, in terms of the strength of an individual, that if you have a foundation built on faith, then fear and how media, you mentioned media, whether it's social or news media or otherwise, the world is just, especially now, just inundating us and in trying its best to instill fear in us.
Yep.
Where I just flat out refuse to walk in fear. I am not, whether it's a virus or anything else, I'm not going to be stupid, but at the same time, I am not going to walk in fear. I have faith that as long as I make smart choices, that I'm protected from it or anything else.
Yeah, man. Wow. That's awesome.
That's right. So obviously we could keep you here all day. I'd love to ask you a bunch more questions, but I know, we have limited time. So what I want to do is just ask you to tell people how they can find you, how they can find information on your ministries, and how, they can reach out if they need to.
I appreciate it, Jeff, and I appreciate Joe, both you guys, for giving me the opportunity to come on today and just share a little bit of my story. And there is more to the story. And again, if people want to get more of the story, they can get it in book form. They can get it on the internet, NikitaKoloff.com. If they want to learn more about the ministry, go to koloff.org, go to mancamp.info, mancamp.info, if they want to learn more about the ministry Lex and I are doing together. So there's a few websites, social media. I do have a Facebook presence. Now I have somebody, an admin, that kind of manages that, because just from a time factor, I just don't spend a lot of time on Facebook, although I will put up some posts and some videos from week to week, and just I like to call or think of myself as the eternal optimist. So, if you're following me on Instagram and Twitter, it's just Nikita Koloff with the number 1 behind it. That's the real me. If you're looking for me on Facebook, you'll look for a picture of me standing in a river with 2 other guys. And the other guys are Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man, and Jason Sanderson. When we made a pilgrimage to Israel several years ago, that's actually the Jordan River where we are baptizing each other. Wow. In the Jordan River. So that's the real me on Facebook. And just message me. And I'll say this too. Let me put this out there. I had a little fun a few weeks ago on social media. I said, hey, if you have a favorite memory, a favorite story, a favorite match, like Joe, you're talking about the Civic Center and the Spectrum, etc., of Nikita Koloff, and maybe it's from wrestling related. Maybe one of the greatest honors I have now is I still do a lot of Legends autograph signings. In fact, I had 3 scheduled for this spring and summer, but we're in the process of rescheduling those. But one of the greatest compliments I'm receiving now is not so much about, hey, I saw you wrestle Ric Flair, in Magnum TA at the Best of 7, is they'll say, hey, you came to my church, you preached 12 years ago, 8 years ago, 15 years ago. Here's the message you spoke that day. And so, if you're a pastor out there or, be interested in having me come into your community, reach out to me, shoot me an email. But I just say all that to say I'm thrilled to be able to interact with all the fans still, go out to the signing, share the stories. But if you have a story, maybe it's from me speaking at your church or at a men's conference or a school assembly or wrestling event, then shoot me an email. Write this down, Nikita, the letter S, right, guys?
That's right.
Yes.
Nikita, the letter S as in Sam, Koloff @gmail.com. And here's why I encourage you to send me your story. Just a short story. It can be a couple paragraphs. I've been working in this lockdown on 4 or 5 new chapters that I will include in my last book, A Tale of the Ring of Redemption. Now, I'm working on a brand new book, but I'm also going to do a second edition to my last book. And your story just might end up in the book. I'm going to do a chapter at the end honoring you, the fan, and your stories and your memories of the Russian Nightmare, Nikita Koloff. So if you got a story out there, submit it, and it may end up in the next edition of A Tale of the Ring of Redemption.
Wow, man, that's amazing. Well, there you go, guys. Look at that. You can, if you were, you were at those matches, or, again, like he said, if you heard anything that was, whether it was at a meeting, at a, at a church, whatever, man, get submissions in there. You can actually be in a book. That's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. That's awesome. Jeff, I look forward to, hey, Jeff, you're not that far away. I might see you at Man Camp sometime soon.
That's right. I will definitely be reaching out because I would like to meet you in person and
yes,
just experience your ministries there. And I definitely have a story, and it involves you doing an interview with Sting, I believe, on TVN.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was amazing. That was an amazing story and interview, and just listening to you and Sting and Lex discuss your faith journey was just impeccable. So I definitely have a story, so I will be reaching out myself.
Well, I appreciate it. And to all the fans out there, just sincerely thank you for being just so loyal and so faithful to our sport, and really appreciate you. And whether I see you at an autograph signing or in a church service or at a Man Camp, I look forward to hopefully meeting you face to face one day. So thank you guys so much for having me on.
Yes,
oh man, thank you, sir. It was a pleasure. Loved it. Loved everything. And man, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, have a great rest of your day, and we'll look forward to maybe catching up and doing this again sometime.
Oh
yes,
man, anytime, sir. And you have a great Easter and a great holiday as well.
All right. Well, happy Easter, everybody out there. God bless you all. Love you and appreciate you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.